Hi, in this video we are going to be discussing about the phenomenon of seafloor spreading, and that encompasses how a sea is being formed, how we form a sea, and how that sea develops and becomes an ocean, and how an ocean keeps widening. Okay, that's why the term implies that the seafloor is spreading. So first of all, to understand this, let us take a look at a map of the tectonic plates and their movements. And then here you can see that we can track their movements. We know that this African plate is moving this way. We know that the South American plate is moving that way. So it's kind of like, okay, if we know how they're moving now, if they're moving this way, so we can kind of make a movie of their movement and kind of rewind them backwards to where they were in the past, millions of years in the past. So in the next thing that I will show you, this is actually a video, but this is not a video this is not an ordinary video that is just created by just some YouTuber out there, but this is really a study. This is a study called the PaleoMap project. So this is really a scientific study. That's the person credited with that. And here we are rewinding back time. So here you have here Africa and you have South America, and we are rewinding what happens to them. So in the past, if we rewind time, so here that's 30 million years ago, then we rewind it back to 40 million years ago, and then we rewind it back to 50 million years ago, and so on and so forth. And you can see the African continent and the South American continent becomes closer and closer and closer and closer together, because again we are rewinding back the time. So therefore, if we fast forward this, there would be a time where those two continents actually were one. See, now at this point, Africa and South America were one, and then now we can and in fact it all the continents join together and become Pangaea, right? And this is the supercontinent that was around 250 200 million years ago. So now let's fast forward. So we are moving this forward. So take note here, that was 200 million years ago, and then it becomes 190 million years ago, then 180. So we are now moving the time forward, and then eventually here you should see a time when South America and Africa split into two. Okay, split into two. So here right now it's starting. South America is now rifting away from Africa. See, and then just about now, so here now they develop an inland sea. So there's a sea in between them already. So before there was none. Before it was like that, and then you start to develop inland seas. Okay, and then eventually that sea would widen and widen and widen, and so until such time that you can call it an ocean. After all, an ocean is just a big stretch of the sea, right? And then once you form that ocean eventually widens and widens and widens and widens. Okay, and this process is called seafloor spreading, right? Seafloor spreading, because just like how the name implies, it means the seafloor spreads, right? And again, this is just related to what we discussed about rift valleys and mid-ocean ridges. So it's the concepts are really just connected. So you have basaltic layer of rock, which is seafloor, right? And then you have granitic layer of rock, right? So at this point, this is one continent, right? And then if this plate diverges into two because of forces in the asthenosphere, again, you form a crack at the center. And when that crack happens, the first manifestation is that because this has moved that way and this has moved that way, the ground at the center has nowhere to go but downwards. It depresses downwards. You form a rift valley, and then it depresses downwards until it reaches the basaltic layer. And then when it reaches the basaltic layer, chances are it will be filled up with water when the rains come. And then when it gets filled up with water, now you have a Great Lake or something like that. And then again, if that lake is now becomes wider and wider such that it joins with the sea, now you form sea, right? But what is the process that fuels this? It's just divergence between the two plates. Rift Valley forms Great Lakes, and then the Great Lakes eventually form a sea. And then again, when the continents are now very, very far apart from each other, like that, and then divergence still happens, such that there's still a crack here. You form a mid-ocean ridge there, and then there's now a lot of water in between. So now you have developed an ocean, and that ocean, guess what? Would if the rifting still continues, that ocean becomes wider and wider and wider. And again, that's that's what happened to South America and Africa. Right now, if you look at South America and Africa, they are very far from each other because the ocean has widened between them. And again, all of this, from continents rifting into rift valleys, to that rift valley developing into a lake, to that lake developing into an inland sea, and the sea developing into an ocean, and an ocean even widening into widening and widening such that it becomes wider and wider. That is just caused by divergence caused by movements in opposite directions of a plate or two plates that are involved, right? Now, but I have to point out something here, and that is, okay, sir, if that's the case where, divergence happens and the ocean floor becomes wider and wider and wider, if that's the case, sir, wouldn't there come a time when all of the Earth will become oceans? Because if the oceans keep you know becoming wider and wider and wider and wider and wider, then the continents of the world will be consumed, and all that is left in the world is just ocean floor. Well, that doesn't happen because you have to remember that when we look at two plates that are diverging, let's say plate one and plate two, and these two plates move that way, you are forgetting the fact that these two plates also are connected to other plates. So while you can see plate 1 and 2 being highlighted here, most probably there is also another plate next to it. Let's call this plate 4, and another plate here. Let's call this plate 3. Okay? And what really happens is when these two plates diverge, obviously this second plate will eventually collide with the fourth plate. So while there is divergence here, there will be convergence here. Okay? While there's divergence here, these two diverge. As this plate moves, it hits the second plate adjacent to it, and therefore there is convergence. Right? And what will happen? What is the difference between the two? Well, here in divergence, remember, magma comes out, forms new seafloor. So there is what we call constructive process, meaning you create new crusts. But what happens in convergence? Well, in convergence, if you know that one of the things that happen in convergence, as was discussed in the previous video, is that one of the plates might subduct under the other. And when it subducts under the other, guess what? The crust gets melted, and therefore here there is a destructive process, meaning here crust is being formed, new ocean floor is being formed, but guess what? If that ocean floor continues to move and hits another continent, it subducts under, and so the ocean floor or that crust is also being destroyed. So therefore, there's this balance where you're forming new seafloor, but on some parts of the world, you are destroying some of the seafloor, right? And in fact, the fear was in the question that they proposed is if the oceans keep on spreading, then maybe all the continents will be consumed by the oceans and there will be no continents anymore. That's not true because remember, in our previous discussion, whenever there's convergence, these crustal material would be destroyed, would be melted, and will bubble up. And again, will form volcanoes here. But guess what? Those volcanoes, if they become active, they might form islands. And what are islands? Islands are parts of the crust where the crustal material is thick enough to poke out of the water. Meaning, because it pokes out of the water, it forms granitic rock, which means it has continental crust. So, while the process, yes, creates new seafloor, it could destroy older seafloor, and it could even form not just new seafloor, but new um, continental crust, and not just oceanic basaltic rock, but also continental crust, which means containing basaltic and granitic rock. So again, this is what happens overall. So while seafloor spreading happens, it's not a problem, and it's not a cause of concern. It's not a cause of concern for saying that maybe all the continents of the world will be consumed, because again, if there are new seafloor being created, at some parts new older seafloor are being destroyed, and in some parts new crustal materials are created, and some of those crustal materials can be continental crust. So you could never really consume all the continental crust in the world, because remember, there's also conservation laws in science, right? So conservation of energy, conservation of momentum. So meaning everything is conserved. Conservation of mass. Whatever mass you have before is also the same mass as what you have before. So here you can imagine that the materials from the asthenosphere and the materials from the crust are just being recycled. Asthenospheric materials become new crust. The old crust that subducts in the asthenosphere becomes asthenospheric material. So therefore, it's just a conservation. So therefore, you could never really add more crust or take away more crust from the earth. So therefore, the amount of land masses, the amount of oceans will never drastically change so as to say that, in the future it will be all oceans or it will be all continents. It can never happen because of conservation of laws. But that is how that is what the concept of seafloor spreading is. It is what is driving. It is connected to how two plates are converging. It has connected to how rift valleys are formed in continental plates. It's connected to how Great Lakes are formed in continental plates. It's connected to how those Great Lakes develop and become an inland sea, and how those seas develop and become oceans, and how the oceans themselves become wider and wider without really threatening to cover the whole of the earth. Because again, if you look at other processes, you also have constructive processes like destructive processes like this. But if you think about it, the bubbling of the materials here and forming new islands here, that's also constructive. It forms new crust. Okay, so that is all that can be discussed about seafloor spreading, or the process of seafloor spreading.